Hi, I'm Monty the Software Engineer, and in this video, we'll be continuing our Qt with Firebase journey by going over authentication with Firebase using just their REST API. With Firebase Authentication, you can add the ability to have your users sign up and sign into user accounts and then start making authenticated calls to your Firebase backend. If you haven't already watched the previous video on using Firebase real-time databases, I do recommend you go back and watch, as we'll be leveraging the database that we set up in that video. First, let's go into our Firebase real-time database and disable public read-write access, as we only want to provide this for authenticated users. So I'll go into my real-time database, and then in my rules. So in the Firebase documentation, there's already a set of rules for an example on how to only allow read-write access to authenticated users. So I'll take this here, I'll copy it, and paste it into my real-time database rules, and then I'll publish it. It says rules published. So let's go to our code from the previous video where we did a GET request, and if we run this, we should see a permission denied message. And yep, right here we can see error permission denied. So let's go ahead and just create a new project. Again, I'll just use a Qt console application as I won't be adding any visuals to this. And then I'll call this Firebase Authentication Example. All right, let's start out by adding network to our project file, as we'll be using Network Access Manager. We'll run qmake, and then let's add a new file project, and let's add a new C++ class, and then I'll call this Auth Handler, and I'll have it inherit QObject. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Firebase Auth REST API documentation. So the first thing we'll need for this Firebase Auth REST API is an API key. And the way we can get that is by adding a new application to our Firebase project. So here I'll add app, and then I'll just call it a web app, and I will say my Qt app. Register the app. And now with my Qt app, we can see that our API key is right here. Let's go back to the Firebase Auth REST API, and we'll look up how to sign up a user just with the email and password. And here we can see sign up with email and password. So here we can see sign up with email and password. The method is going to be post, and then the URL is this, and then our API key is here. We can see the required information in the payload. We need the email and password, as well as this return secure token. And it says this secure token should always be true. We can see an example of how to do it via curl. So let's go ahead and add this to our project. First, in our auth handler, let's make a private member, which will be a Q string called m API key. And then let's create a setter for it, void set API key. And it'll take a Q string, API key. Let's add that to our CPP. And let's set the initial state of it. M API key is just going to be a blank Q string. Here we'll set it. M API key equals API key. And let's also add our include for Q Network Access Manager, as well as Q Network Reply. Let's create pointers for our Q Network Access Manager as well as our Q Network Reply. Q Network Access Manager, M Network Access Manager, and then Q Network Reply, M Network Reply. And if you remember from our last video, we'll want to create a slot for the network reply when there's information ready to be read. So we'll do public slots, void network reply ready read. Let's go to our constructor, and we'll say m network access manager equals new Q network access manager. Give this as the parent. And even though Qt will destroy network access manager whenever the instance of auth handler is destroyed, Let's just go ahead and add a destructor for good practice. We'll add that to our C++. And then we'll say m network access manager dot delete later. And then let's go ahead and add the implementation for our network reply ready read. Let's include qdebug. And for now, let's just debug out m network reply dot read all. All right, so let's add a function in our auth handler. We'll call it void sign user up, and it will take a email address as well as a password. And let's add a function that will perform the post, and this will take a URL as well as a payload, and the payload is going to be a QJSON document. So const QJSON document, and this will be the payload. So let's go ahead and add these functions to our C++. First we'll add the perform post, and then we'll add our sign user up. So if we go back to the API documentation, we can see here this is the endpoint, so we're just going to copy this. And then here we'll make a QString, and we'll say sign up endpoint equals the text that we copied. And then let's change the API key plus m API key. And then let's make the required payload of the email, password, and return secure token. So first we'll add our qvariant map. Then here, let's create the qvariant map, and we'll call this variant payload. And then let's see what keys we need, just email, password. So we'll say variant payload email equals the email address that we passed into this function. And the variant payload password is going to equal the password that we passed in as well. And then we need the return secure token, which should always be true. So variant payload, return secure token, and we'll set that equal to true. Now let's create a QJSON document, and we'll call this our JSON payload, which will equal QJSON document from variant, and we'll pass it the variant payload. And then let's perform the post with our endpoint and our payload. So perform post, sign up endpoint, and JSON payload. And now let's add the code in for the post. We'll need to add a Q network request here. And then back here, we'll say Q network request. And we'll call this new request, and we'll pass in the URL. Here it says parentheses were disambiguated, so let's just apply the fix. There we go. Then we need to set the content header of the new request. Set header Q network request content type header, and this will be application JSON. And then we'll set our m network reply equal to our m network access manager post, and for the network request we'll say new request, and then we'll also add in our JSON payload.toJSON. And now let's add in our connection for when m network reply has come back with ready read information. So connect m network reply. The signal is going to be ready read, connected to this, and the auth handler slot is network reply ready read. So when m network reply comes back with information from the post, it'll go here, network reply ready read. Let's also add in our m network reply dot delete later. All right, so let's go back to our main.cpp, and we will include our auth handler. Let's create an instance of it, auth handler, and we'll just name it auth handler. Let's set the API key, set API key, and we'll go back to our Firebase console. We'll copy this API key here. And let's pass it in this. And then let's add auth handler.sign user up. We'll give it an email address, test@email.com, and then we'll give it a password, 123 exclamation point. Now, before we run that, let's go to our Firebase console. Let's go to Authentication. We'll hit Get Started. And here we can set up the different types of authentication we'll allow our app to use. So we just want email and password. So let's enable it. Save. And now email password is enabled. Let's go to our users. And we can see here we have no users yet. So when we run this, it should add our new test email user. So let's run it. And here we can see we got back an ID token, as well as a bunch of other information like the emails, the test email, our refresh token when the token expires. And let's go back to our Firebase console. Let's refresh this. And now we can see that we have our new user, test@email.com, their user ID. So that worked. Now let's see what happens if we try to sign up the user again using the same email address. So let's first clear this. We'll stop the application, clear again, and now let's run it. Let me make this a little bigger. So here you can see that we get an error back. The email already exists, so that works well. We can also go into our Firebase console, and here we can see we can reset password, disable accounts, delete accounts. So let's go ahead and delete this account again. And then in our Qt project, let's run it so that you can see the message bigger. And here we can see that the sign user up call was successful. We got our ID token, our refresh token, and when the token expires. So now let's go to our auth handler and add, let's close this, and we'll add a function to sign a user in. And it'll take the same email address and password here. So I'll copy and paste that. And then let's add this to our C++. And then let's go ahead and look at the API documentation, sign in with email and password. So it's going to be a post. This is the endpoint here. And then the payload is going to be the same as what we had for our sign up user. So email, password, and then return secure token. So let's go ahead and add that. Since it's very similar to sign user up, I'll just go ahead and copy this, and paste it, and then we'll just update the endpoint. Copy this, and then let's rename this to sign in endpoint. Let's change the endpoint. Good. And then we also need the perform post. So let's paste that. And then this is going to be the sign in endpoint now. And since we've already implemented perform post, we should be able to just use this sign user in function now. So let's go to our main CPP. Instead of sign user up, we'll say sign user in. And now let's clear our application output and run this. So there we go. We can see that the user has been signed in successfully. So how can we use this to make authenticated calls to our real-time database? Well, if we go to the Firebase database REST API documentation, we can see here there's a real-time database user auth. It goes over two methods that you can authenticate, one with the Google OAuth 2 or Firebase ID tokens. We'll go with method 2 since we have Firebase ID tokens. And here you can see the endpoint scheme is the same as in our last video with the real-time database, only now you add this tag with the auth and ID token. So let's first extract that ID token from our message payload. I'm going to add a function called parse response. And it'll take a qbyte array, and it'll be response. Let's add this into our C++. And now when we get data back from our network reply, let's actually set qbyte array response equals m network reply read all, and then we will call parse response, and we'll pass it our response. Now let's take a look at our application output. If we look at the JSON here, we can see that there's no type of error in here. So let's see what happens if we do get an error. Let's just change this to the wrong password, and we'll run it. And we didn't see any output because I removed the qdebug here. So let's go ahead and add that back in. Qdebug response. All right, rerun it. All right, good. Now we can see that we have an error here, invalid password. And the reason I wanted to do that was so that we can kind of do some error catching here in our parse response. So let's first make a QJSON document called JSON document, which will equal QJSON document from JSON, and our JSON is the response. First, we're going to need to add QJSON object. Let's go back down. So let's catch whenever we get an error, and we'll say if JSON document dot object contains error. Let's have it debug out, qdebug error occurred, and then we'll just print out what the response was. Oh, and it looks like I spelled response wrong, so let's refactor this. Response, good. Otherwise, we can go back to our successful response. There's a kind here, so let's trigger off of that. Else if JSON document dot object contains kind. And we can see our ID token is here. So we'll have a Q string, ID token equals our JSON document dot object, and then we'll get the value of ID token. To string. And now let's say qdebug obtained user ID token, and let's print out the ID token. And now let's clear the application output and run it again. So run. Here we can see that we have our initial printout from our network reply ready read. Let me just remove this. And then we can also see that an error occurred, which is here, and what the response was. So let's go ahead and clear this again, and we'll go back to our main.cpp. We'll put the correct password in and run it. And here we can see obtained user ID token, and this is the token. So let's go to Auth Handler. Let's first close this. We will let's add a private Q string called m ID token. We can go back to our parse response, remove the qdebug, and we'll set our m ID token equal to ID token. Let's add a signal here. User signed in. And this way we can connect any other class that we want to the Auth Handler's user signed in signal, and this will notify that object that Auth Handler has successfully signed a user in. So then let's emit user signed in. All right, so let's create a slot within Auth Handler just so we can catch this without creating another class. If you were to implement this in an actual application, you probably do want to put this in a different class. But here, let's just say now we'll want to perform authenticated database call. Let's go ahead and add this to our C++. Then here, let's create a queue string. We'll call it the endpoint. And then we'll go to our Firebase console. Let's go to our real-time database. Here's the database we set up in the last video. Let's grab this URL. Set the endpoint equal to the URL. And then let's just grab our pets.json here, pets.json. And then we'll also add in that auth tag here. We can see it's question mark auth equals ID token. So question mark auth equals, and then we'll add in our M ID token. And then let's say our M network reply is going to equal our M network access manager dot get, put in a new queue network request here, network request, a queue URL of our endpoint. Oh, it's supposed to be a capital P. And then let's add the connection for our M network reply. We'll just copy this. So when the get request returns with some information, hopefully we'll get back our pets.json. So it will go to our network reply ready read, which will go to a parse response here. And then we'll just say else queue debug. The response was, and then we'll add the response. All right, so if this works properly, we'll call Auth Handler sign user in. So when sign user in is called, it'll perform a post, which is here. We set our network reply equal to the queue network reply of the post. And when we get back information, it'll parse the response. Let's add in a queue debug here so that we can see what's happening. Let's just say queue debug. User signed in successfully. And then this will emit the user signed in signal, which we catch here in the auth handler to perform an authenticated database call. Actually, I don't think we added that connection, so let's go ahead and add that here in our constructor. We'll say connect this, and we'll catch the signal. Oh. User signed in. We'll call the slot perform authenticated database call. All right, so whenever Auth Handler emits the signal that the user has been successfully signed in, it'll perform an authenticated database call, which we can see we add in a tag for our ID token that we obtained through signing in. So let's go ahead and run that, see what happens. There we go. We can see our user signed in successfully, and the response was our pets.json, which contains all of our pets, Mercy, Monty, and our elephant Dumbo, the type of food they eat, and the type of animal they are. Now let's see what happens if we used an incorrect password. Let's clear the output here, and then run it again. And now you can see an error has occurred, invalid password. And now one more time, let's just sign a new user up. And we'll call this user2 at user.com. And then their password will just be that. Let's clear the output here. And we'll run it. And we can see that the user signed in successfully. This should actually be user signed up, but we don't catch the difference between user sign in or user sign up. But we can see that we got the data from the database correctly. If we go back to our Firebase console, go to authentication, we can now see that we have these users. Let's go ahead and delete user2. And then we'll change this to user sign in. Let's run the example again. And then we can see here we have an error occurred, and the error was email not found. So we can see that the user tried to sign in with an email account that doesn't work or was deleted, and we get the correct error.